Hey everyone. So good to be with you again for our next session here in our quarterly teachers intensive. I'm not sure if this is helping as goes given it in bite-sized chunks like this throughout the course of the quarter versus laying it all out there for you and then making you go back and figure out which one goes where. Because as we get past this week, our upcoming lesson for the week is going to be the one we're focusing on today. And then of course the one behind that 2 weeks from this Sunday. But anyway, focusing on the theme of Exodus, and we go to the portion of Matthew chapter 26, verses 31 through 46, 52 to 56, we have the betrayal of Jesus. But it's interesting here in Matthew's gospel, we actually have a citation from the scroll of Zechariah, which I believe Matthew is the only gospel who makes that clear for us as he draws out this reference. And so focusing first on the middle portion of the screen, you'll see in both the blue and the purple box, we have the same repeated phrase. So what I'm going to be doing is working a little bit through the Zechariah text, since Matthew gives us an allusion there through the words of Jesus when he says, tonight what's going to happen is going to be the fulfillment of what the prophet says. The shepherd is going to be struck and the sheep will be scattered. And so what we should see in that is it's not simply meant to be understood as Zechariah is not saying only that Jesus is going to be betrayed, and then with that his sheep are going to be scattered, because Zechariah has a whole lot more to say in that particular context, nor is it just isolating a particular moment from what Zechariah is saying as if to say that's the only applicable point to this moment, because a prophecy has everything to do with what's contained inside that prophecy or that oracle versus just spattered little pieces. Because if we only sliced it up into little bits, many of those prophecies could be potentially fulfilled by anyone versus one specific person. And so we understand that there are more parallels or points of parallel to draw out between what Zechariah says and what Matthew says. That being said, we understand here, let me go first to this black box on the left side of the screen, where Zechariah opens up the 13th chapter, where this particular prophecy of the shepherd being struck and the sheep scattered. In verse 1, he says, "On that day, a fountain will be opened for the house of David and for the residents of Jerusalem to wash away sin and impurity." To make sure this is clear, what I hope you understand is that this should be understood as, and I think perhaps it's most clear when we appreciate it in the context of what is going on in the terminal end of the Passion Week, because this is the thing that affects the moment of redemption for all of humanity, obviously. But when we bridge this over into the book of Acts, when the time comes at the preaching of the gospel and the arrival of the kingdom and its Messiah and King at Pentecost, we have a moment when these people are appreciating and accepting the fact that they are guiltily responsible for the murder of Messiah, but they also now have the chance to repent of that and to be washed clean of their sins. And so if that's the case, then I don't see how this is anything less than a fulfillment of what Zechariah says in Zechariah 13:1. Okay, so that situates us in the time of what has already transpired versus waiting on this to be a once future thing, as if to say this is only going to come at the inauguration of a millennial kingdom when Christ returns, and the Jews as a nation who has survived through the great tribulation are now going to see the one they pierced, mourn for him as a firstborn one, and then by virtue of that, there will now be a fountain open for them to receive healing from their sins. That would almost negate the idea of any Jew who's come to Christ in the last 2,000 years, or that this is meant to be seen solely as a national prophecy for a corporate Israel, rather than on the individual basis of any one Jew who comes to Christ in saving faith. All that to say, if we appreciate this, at least in part being fulfilled with what was Jesus was doing in the Passion narrative, then we can appreciate more of what's going to come after it. So, first blue box, a shepherd king is rejected in the time of the anointed one's reign and a new temple being built. So before we go further with these orange boxes, let's go back to the left side of the screen. We understand Cyrus is the anointed one of Isaiah 41 and 45. This is exactly what he's called. And Cyrus, of course, is the one who is ruling in the days of Zechariah. We must understand that in order for us to better appreciate what's happening circumstantially. Now, that's not to say that he's the one who continues to reign throughout the time of Zechariah's administration as a prophet. But Zechariah returned with that first wave of exiles. They start to build the temple, then it undergoes a period of dormancy until eventually a new Persian emperor rises to the throne. And with that, they will continue to work after the period of latency has come to its end. And Zechariah and Haggai are these prophets the Lord has raised up for the sake of pumping the people up to do this job of building the temple. Okay, so if we understand that the process at least starts with Cyrus, we go back to Isaiah chapters 40 through 48, we understand that Israel as a whole seems to reject the idea of what's being announced to them and what's being dispelled and made clear. Because how can that be? The Davidic descendant is supposed to be the one who lets them go out of the land, restores them to the land, gives them their city and temple back, and of course is going to build the temple. But Cyrus is actually the anointed Mashiach who gives the people the release they were waiting for, allows them to build the temple on his dime as they also restore the city. In the context of Zechariah 13, he is the shepherd king. And both of these people are rejected in some way by Israel. And we don't have time to go through the full context of Zechariah 13. I would encourage you to go back and read it. And you're going to have to reread it several times because it's something that most of us don't normally read. And with that, we'll have to ground ourselves in what's being said. But I'm going to give you a few verses from it, from 7 through 9. So what's being said here, by the Lord's sword, awake against my shepherd, that Zechariah, against the man who is my associate. So we should clearly understand, this is drilling it further down to appreciate who's the spokesman of the Lord here. This is the declaration of the Lord of armies. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. So obviously, we see that Zechariah is not undergoing physical malignment, or I don't think that's supposed to be what we understand by this particular passage. But what we do get is the idea that he is rejected. The people have decided to close their ears to his message. And by virtue of that, we see also in the context of this passage that as he's rejected, he tells the people, fine, if you don't want me, I don't want to do this work. I don't want to continue to be your shepherd. And so then he says, give me the value of my wages, which happens to be 30 pieces of silver. And that's not coincidental, as goes the fact that Judas betrays Jesus for 30 pieces rather than the 20 pieces that Joseph was sold for, even though that story has connections to this as well. It's the 30 pieces that we focus on in the moment when Judas actually seals that deal. And that connects us back to what Matthew says of the shepherd being struck, as goes the betrayal that's about to transpire in the garden when he will be seized. And by virtue of that, the ultimate rejection on the part of the people of Israel, as he is the prophet of the Lord, they don't want to hear what he has to say either, and they're going to kill him for it. Now we go to verse 8. In the whole land, this is the Lord's declaration, 2/3 will be cut off and die, but 1/3 will be left. Now, as goes just the concept of multiple fulfillments of any one particular prophecy, I think we should appreciate that here too, as potentially being seen as something that occurred at more than one point in history, mostly, if not exclusively, during this particular period of time. Because when you think about it, while it's not exact math, that night, while Jesus takes 3 of his disciples, which would equal up to a 4th, with him in the garden, and they go further into this moment when Jesus is going to pray and then ask the Father if it's possible he may let this cup pass from him and so forth. And then they are the ones that witness the betrayal on the part of Judas, and then Jesus is seized in front of them, and then they all run away in fear. The other disciples presumably aren't in the garden, or if they were at a distance. And when maybe they see Peter, James, and John running down. And when they do, they are all afraid of what's going on. And of course, wherever they are while the events of the Passion are transpiring, after Jesus is laid in the tomb, we understand that they are all hiding from the Romans, cowering in fear. So, granted, none of them die, at least not immediately. They will later on, suffering their own martyrs' deaths. But my point is that it would seem as the shepherd is struck and the sheep are scattered, in keeping with Zechariah's prophecy, that we do see a measure of this being fulfilled, with the idea of at least a portion remain with Jesus while the rest scatter. I think another fulfillment of this actually comes when we see Jerusalem under siege by the Romans, but I digress. We won't go into that now. Then in verse 9, I will put this 1/3 through the fire, and I will refine them as silver is refined. test them as gold. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is our God. So there seems to be a remnant here that is drawn back, and perhaps that could have been part of the reason why Jesus chose these three as an inner sanctum for himself. And with that, these men are refined as fire and become the leaders of the effort of the church and the ministry of the church after Jesus leaves the scene. We don't have to strain that too much beyond that, just to simply say, I think there are fine points of parallel between what Matthew is hinting at and what has already been seen in the context of his gospel. So that being said, let's start to bridge this gap and move this over to the Matthean text, walking first through Luke, because Luke adds a few extra details here when we get to the fact Jesus tells Peter that he's going to deny him. He says, Lord, I'm ready to go with you both to prison and to death. But he says, Peter, before the rooster will crow today, you will deny 3 times that you even know me. This is the most specific rendering of this. And so with that, this bolsters the idea of the sheep being scattered through their fear, and then ultimately they will be refined, because the Lord also tells Peter in this moment, Satan has desired to sift you as wheat. He wants to destroy you, and I'm going to let him to a point, but I prayed for you so that your faith won't fail you. This is a refinement process that Peter is going to have to undergo, so that when he is strengthened through this, as Jesus goes on to say, that when you've turned, strengthen your brothers. Okay. Then we go back to the Matthean text, chapter 26. So they come to a place called Gethsemane. He told his disciples, sit here while I go over there and pray. He takes Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee, going back to this. And then Jesus said to them in verse 31, tonight all of you will fall away because of me, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Why does he say this? I mean, of all the different prophecies that's been fulfilled, what is the point of drawing out what is being said here by Zechariah? It points us back as an indicator to the timing of Zechariah's prophecy itself, because what we appreciate in this purple box, a shepherd king is rejected in the time of the anointed one's reign. The anointed one here, of course, being Jesus. So his reign is about to begin, and he is already being rejected by Israel as their king. They say that in so much when Pilate tells them, this is your king. We have no king but Caesar, right? So Jesus has announced the arrival and inauguration of the kingdom of God in human history. We can't make bones about that. He is being inaugurated and installed as their king through his crucifixion. That's the words of John in John chapter 3 and 12. When he is lifted up, he will draw all men to himself. That's the Isaiah 6 language of the Lord being high and lifted up in Isaiah's vision. So all that to say, there's no bones about the fact that Jesus has brought the kingdom and he has been installed as its king. He is being rejected. And this is at a time when a new temple is being built. And again, go back to John 2, various other places, where we see the theme is quite clear that Jesus has not only come to bring the kingdom, but this new temple, which is himself, and the temple that is built upon him as the foundation, the chief cornerstone. So then we go to the next black box on the right side of the screen. We have Jesus telling them, drink from it, all of you. This is the blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins, which takes us back all the way over here so that we can appreciate how that is inaugurating what Zechariah is talking about. We also appreciate the fact Jesus is the anointed shepherd king. Israel rejects Israel rejects Jesus, and the disciples do as well. Think about this. Why do they run from him? Thomas was encouraging them in John's gospel to go with him to Judea once more for the raising of Lazarus. And if it meant their deaths, then so be it. None of them renounce this. None of them balk at it, that we get in the text of it anyway, and say, no, we don't want to go. They all are willing to pony up and go with Jesus, even if it means to certain death. So why now, when the stakes are real, do they run? You could say, well, it's the instinct of human fear. I won't say that's not operative there. I'm just saying this goes back to what's being said here. And in the full context of all of Zechariah, this shepherd king's being rejected. So his disciples are rejecting him as well. We have Peter perhaps being the one who manifests this most when he denies Jesus 3 times. Yet the disciples are the remnant that are refined, because through this, they will wind up surviving the crucible to become stronger in their faith, and they will never deny him again. They will go willingly to their own demises, the martyrs' deaths that wait for all of them for the sake of sharing this beautiful message. So what we see here is an actual exile and exodus sequence in the garden, if you think about it, because This is an exile when there's a rejection on the part of the Lord. They don't want his spokesman. But while they do reject, there will be some from amongst them that are refined and are drawn through this process to become stronger. And the end result will be the fact that they are his people and that he is their God. This is the very language of the Exodus narrative itself from the book of Exodus, where he is calling them his people and he will be their God. And so, if that is also going on here in the context of what's seen here in the gospel accounts, then we appreciate there's an exile sequence when the disciples reject and run. But by virtue of that, there's also a redemptive salvific moment as well. So I hope that's been helpful. Thanks for listening.